Hi, this is Tasha Austin, host of Critical Conversations with NJTESOL-NJBE, where we discuss how to counter anti-Black racism in language education, starting with ourselves.
Our resource is No Longer the Silent Subgroup by Drs. Cooper, Bryan, and Babatunji Ifarinu. Our guest is Jessica Hunston, the adult education SIG representative for NJTESOL and NJBE, who focuses on community-based organizations and reciprocal learning.
Thanks for joining us. Now, let's have a critical conversation.
Hello, welcome back to Critical Conversations. My name is Jessica Hunston. I am the guest host today, and I will let our guest introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tasha Austin. I am typically the host of Critical Conversations, but we are so excited to have our guest host here, Jess Hunston, who for this episode, we decided to flip the script a bit. So I will have an opportunity to speak to some of these collective questions, and I'm excited to do so.
Great. In our article for this month's conversation, No Longer the Silent Subgroup by Ayanna Cooper, Kisha C. Bryan, and Babatunji Ifarinu, they explain how our teaching and attitudes need to adapt to the needs of Black English learners or Black Ls. As we do each month, we'll take questions that NJTESOL-NJBE Executive Board members have posted, and we use those to discuss the article and reflect on our own context within which we are working. So we're going to start with the first question. This article begins with an acknowledgement that the field of English as a second language is neither neutral nor without its politics and pedagogy of desire and investment. So one of the questions gets at this idea, so we'll go ahead and start there. So the question is, can politics ever be excluded when we are talking about the people, communities represented within it?
I mean, the answer is no, is definitely a no for sure. I think the reason that we even have to be overt about calling out the fact that politics exist within language education in general, language teacher preparation, education, is because there is this push, this active silence about framing certain folks as being apolitical or framing certain subjects as being apolitical. And I think the whole reason that you have to call it out is because it is there, but there's such an immense effort to dehistoricize and frame as apolitical a discipline and even sub-disciplines that are highly politicized. Any institution that is charged with developing the minds of the next generation, they have to do that in a contextualized way. And so to the extent that we try to present language or education or the combination of the two as a field capable of an approach that is disconnected from humanity is deeply problematic. And so I think the power of this article, even in the title and saying no longer the silent subgroup, is to center the fact that that silencing is active. I think that it feels more comfortable to default towards the, this kind of, I don't want to say passive, but as if it's an agentless kind of destruction or violence towards Black, either emerging bilingual populations, Black people in general. It's not agentless. And so probably one of the most powerful things for me is just even having the image associated with the article, but also the title itself that's saying no longer the silent subgroup, because it's not about, is it political or not? It's about calling out the fact that there's this active silencing that's occurring within language education and even language teacher preparation.
Thanks, Tasha. And I wanted to, that takes us right into the next question, which is, the authors of this article pose the question, how might we continue to learn about and support a subgroup of Ls when many people don't know the population exists? And they then proceed to review some statistics to help frame the US population of Black Ls. And within our own organization, we had a related question. And so this question is, how can we collect this data from our community to help us begin the work of centering Black L's languages and experiences?
Yeah, it's so interesting to me because I enter the work, I think, differently as, you know, a Black American, someone for whom, you know, at home we speak Black English and Standard English. And then in my academic pursuits, you know, I acquired or began to speak Spanish and even different, if you want to call them registers of Spanish even. And so it's interesting when we're like, how do we help these groups to materialize within the discipline, because they're highly visible, right? They're not invisible in real life. I was looking at a recent Pew Research study that was highlighting the diversity among folks who are classified as racially Black in the United States. And it's all about these geopolitical lines, which is super interesting. When you look at it state by state, you see huge populations in Georgia, in Houston. But then when you look at it just by region, like there is critical mass right here in New Jersey, but it's like collected into the tri-state, right? It's like this overlap between New York, New Jersey, which, you know, we could go into all this colonial rhetoric with that right there, right? Because it's not really like these spaces aren't, you know, legitimately like along state lines anyway. But in talking about making this reality materialize again within the institution, because there's a huge Haitian population that you can see right here in New Jersey. There's a huge Black Latinx population that you can see. These numbers just get suppressed when we cross institutional lines. And what I mean suppressed is like suppressed in terms of being reflected in resources. So when you see things that are highlighting the fact that Black Latinx people exist, it's usually in a marginalized outlet. Somebody's blog post, somebody's YouTube video, you know, us searching for resources to find it in Language Magazine, to find it in, you know, academics have a hard time finding a place. Where am I going to publish this work about Black people who are multilingual? Because, you know, it'll get suppressed in spaces that consider themselves to be linguistics. It will get suppressed in spaces that consider themselves even to be multilingual journals that have higher visibility among maybe like Asian multilingual folks or even white presenting or white multilingual folks. And so for me, I think it's more a question of like, where do we find the Black multilingual people, but helping them to actually materialize within institutional spaces, because they're there, like they're everywhere actually. And because of the large numbers that exist in, especially in this area, I think it really holds a mirror up to us, because how can folks be so present in reality, but be so absent in the classroom, you know? And it takes me back to the Manica Brooks interview where we looked at her work and talked about, you have students in the class who are literally like protesting in their silence. Like, if you're not going to consider anything that I produce, any language that I produce to be legitimate, my protest is I won't produce any. So, you know, I think it's incumbent upon us, the same way that we do our research, to ensure that we can reflect multilingual learners in our spaces who are from all over the world, but who look a certain way. We should be making the same, if not more, efforts to ensure that Black multilingual students see themselves not just in text and representations, but in their teachers. I was just like having a conversation with a Black language scholar who was talking about, you know, her heritage being from South Carolina and being a speaker of Gullah. And there's no representation of Gullah speakers, you know, or even kind of like this legitimizing of the transition of migratory patterns of Black people the world over, and how, you know, West African languages have evolved and still show up in, you know, Black English, in Gullah. So all of those things I feel like really kind of just represents, again, more of that active suppression than it does of like, I wonder where the Black multilingual speakers are. They're there. They're mislabeled. You know, they're placed in special education sometimes when that's not the appropriate setting for them. They are, you know, told or categorized as having speech issues, right? Literally sent to speech therapists, pathologized. But definitely, it's not that they're not there, it's that we're not seeing them.
Right. And it that takes us right into the next section of the article, but also an additional question. And my understanding is that for a while, the language education field has been problematizing this idea of native speaker, non-native speaker, this native speaker, non-native speaker paradigm. But this article situates this in the context of African-American vernacular English, Caribbean English, English Creole, and specifically the ways in which we identify who is eligible for language services. And so prior to answering this question, we might need to discuss the details of the article a bit more, but I'm not sure. I'm going to put out the question there anyway, and then we can come back to the article as needed. But can we advocate for a space literally in the eligibility process for self-identification? And how can we achieve this ideal?
Oof.
It's a big question. I know it came straight from the NJTESOL-NJBE board.
You know why that's so heavy is because like self-identification is like a larger question of power that we just need to deal with head on. We could talk on the micro level of, like, I'm thinking about this Patrian Smith article I read. She was writing about a Jamaican young woman who like just didn't fit anywhere, right? A native English speaker, but not from the United States, who once she came to the United States, Black Americans rejected her because she didn't really speak Black English, but then she got in the classroom and she was rejected there because she was Black. And so like all these other identity-based challenges arise out of not having an opportunity to self-identify. And so on the micro level, you know, I'm thinking about that article and like taking your like, oh, what is it called now? I can't think of that. What is that group that does the PISA scores, right? So like,
sure,
you have to fill in these bubbles. Who are you? And none of the bubbles match who you are. Right? So you're Black. So that means you could be Trinidadian, Jamaican, Nigerian, African-American, Grenadian, you can be any, but Black, right? So already there's a level of erasure. And then you have to mark the language that you speak. And to you speak English, but according to what they expect you to produce, you don't. And so legitimizing who you are within categories that were not really built to support your complexity or your identity, but that are more meant to kind of sustain hierarchies and sustain colonial patterns that would allow for, you know, the groupings to represent this kind of majority minority separation. It's very painful to kind of go through life constantly not seeing yourself reflected anywhere. So you've got to miscategorize yourself to even be eligible to sit for some of these exams. And so when I'm thinking about like what that looks like in our classrooms, you know, there's a lot of power, and we talked about this. I'm trying to think, it might've been in talking with Anel during that interview. We talked about how students themselves are a resource and how we don't need to speak for them. We don't need to give voice. Students have voice. We don't need to give them that. But how we can't probably get a better understanding of who they are than from they themselves. So we talked about the resource that we find in ensuring that we're centering the identities and the voices and the complexities of the students before us. But then we also took ownership of the responsibility that we have as educators to do our research. Like if I can look at the latest Pew Research information and know that the likelihood that if I have Black multilingual students, that they're probably going to be from the Caribbean, from West Africa, or Spanish speakers, that's on me, right? To kind of have that background prepared so that as I work with students who are placed in these settings, that they're not trying to explain entire socio-political histories to me, migratory patterns to me. That's not on them. They're coming to school. Right? So I can't come totally empty and unprepared and then saying to my students, teach me, right? Like, you know, all the things, come teach me, because white students don't have to come to school and like, you know, come teach their teachers. They don't. They come to school and they learn of themselves. They learn of their histories. They learn of, now, I don't think that that's done well either, to be honest. I think it's a two-tier problem, right? So if I'm a white student coming to school, I might come to believe that I am all there is in the world. Right. And I get hit with all the mythology of Terra Nullis and Manifest Destiny. And I'm made to believe that, you know, everyone else is in service of me. So I think it's problematic on both sides. But I don't ever want us to get to the space where, in recognizing that students come with their histories and their insights and their expertise, that relinquishes us from doing our work. So, you know, I think in that like multifaceted way, we have to see our students for the resources that they bring, for the beauty and the complexity that they represent, but also do our work.
Yeah, I hear you. And I've thought about that a lot as an educator, and continue to think about how important it is as a white woman to be doing that work and to be thinking about educating myself, not asking students, Black people, people of color, to teach me about the work that I should be doing. And so I really appreciate you saying that in just the practice of the classroom and working with students. And so I'm going to go to the next part of the article and another question, but the authors, referencing James Baldwin, say if the speakers are devalued and marginalized, then so will their language be devalued and marginalized. And as one of our board members said, Baldwin reminds us how close the ties are between language and identity. Children perceive when their language is rejected, and that is essentially a rejection of them. So for this next question, I'm combining a comment and question posted from our board members. So the comment was, we must be more critical of standard languages and academic language, all deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, Orientalism, settler colonialism, and neoliberalism. All devalue and marginalize speakers. So the question is, and I think we might want to reframe this question a bit, but I'm just reading it as exactly as it was posted, but how do I teach students to value their home vernacular dialect while at the same time teaching them standard English? Or is standard English no longer important? So we can reframe that question. We can talk about maybe what the question could be, but I thought it would be a good place to think about and talk about some really key pieces of the article.
Yeah, like James Baldwin is just unparalleled.
Yeah.
He just gets right at the heart of the matter.
He sure does.
I just so appreciate not mincing words about language being completely representative of humanity. And so if I delegitimize what comes out of your mouth, I'm delegitimizing you as a person. And I think about that a lot with all of this just wanton violence and the lives that have been lost, these children, these babies who, you know, everything about them was seen as inherently violent, inherently unworthy of life, even in death, in looking at, you know, how the mishandling of remains of children, right, by institutions, thinking about, you know, Dante Wright and Adam Toledo. And, you know, I wish I didn't have so many names, you know, Makia Bryan, Anthony Thompson, just, it comes so fast and hard that you can no longer pretend, because I'm part of a generation that there was still this kind of belief, this 90s generation belief that like, if you showed up a certain way that you could maybe be spared the violence, right? Like, don't speak that way, don't dress that way. You know, just don't try to appear like anything that might scare white folks, which is sounds like the craziest thing, but frankly, I could see the desperation of a people who's just simply trying to survive, right? Yeah. So as much as I want to be critical of respectability politics in that way, I definitely don't fully blame generations of folks who are looking for ways to make it to the next day. But that being said, in terms of having these kind of levels or determinations of what constitutes a standard as opposed to not, you know, I immediately think of Dr. Jonathan Rosa and his concept of languagelessness. And, once I get to delegitimize the language you produce, I get to classify you as subhuman. And so I think as much as we try to separate these academic disciplines and categories, we have to be quite frank with ourselves that what is happening linguistically in terms of us pretending, because we have the data to know it's not true, that by virtue of asking Black speakers to leave a part of themselves at home and to not cultivate a part of themselves that's so deeply rooted in their cultural being, which is the way that they express themselves through language, we're not addressing the fuller social picture of them being fully human wherever they go. And we're not really benefiting them by asking them to hold back parts of themselves, because we know in the end, it's not going to save them. Like, April Baker Bell's book starts with naming, and it's unfortunate, right? Because it's a couple years old now, but there's always a new name to list of folks who are just murdered at the hands of the establishment, at the hands of the state, and language didn't save them, right? So if we've asked you for your whole life to deny your own humanity by not showing up in your full linguistic self, and then you arrive at the day where that doesn't save you, then what did we do for your quality of life prior to that moment if it didn't really help you? So, I can see where the question maybe was posted in folks who might have been told to code switch, folks who might have been told, like, if you speak right, or if you wear certain clothes, like you have a greater likelihood of surviving or like getting a job, because I've heard that rhetoric in my own life. So while I wouldn't agree with asking that question per se, like how do we make Black folks like feel like their own language is legitimate, I would be much more interested in what we can do in these institutional spaces that were kind of built on hierarchies. Like the heart of a lot of these institutional spaces is to be able to restrict what is counted as legitimate and then kind of monetize it, right? So like, if I tell you that there's only a very specific way of languaging, because, my background is world language, because when I have these conversations, I talk about English and ESOL, but it happens when you teach Spanish. It happens when you teach French. It happens across all these imperial languages that restrict what they consider to be the standard production of the language. And then it kind of becomes monetized. It becomes a big moneymaker. Well, are you speaking it right? Because if you speak it right, you can tap into the global market, things of that nature. And then folks who have like these beautiful, rich languaging practices are automatically locked out of that system. And it gets so deep that in a ratio-linguistic perspective, so that's Flores and Rosa, they've already done the work to prove that even if you are a Black or minoritized person producing the Queen's English, you're still not going to get the same opportunities, because rather than thinking about, can I produce it to the standard, it's actually about the listener. It's about what are you hearing once you receive it. So there's work that's been done on accentism, that I'm thinking about John Baugh, who did like linguistic profiling maybe in the 80s or 90s. And he's a whole scholar who was already hired and then needed to move to get housing closer to the university. And he began to call around for real estate, and they would hear his voice and say, we don't have anything available. And so he began to change his voice because his name was racially ambiguous. So he began to change the way he spoke, and they said, oh yes, please come see this property. And then he would like change to like more of a Latinx accent. And they would say, we're sorry, we don't have anything. And then he would change to more African-American vernacular, and oh, we're sorry, we don't have anything. And so he turned it into an entire study. So this isn't new. This isn't a new phenomenon. It's not, all of a sudden we discovered that it's about the listener. It's always been about the listener, but how do we monetize white supremacy in a way that's not going to favor, the white establishment? You can't, but what you can do is monetize the minoritized populations and say, well, we can train you, we can help you take these classes, take these courses, buy these books. And then when you walk away with that credential and you still can't get housing, you lose again, right? So I think, again, like I understand where that question was coming from about folks who might have been raised to kind of like suppress those parts of themselves. But I think we see that across many populations that are minoritized. I don't think it's just Black speakers, because I've had countless Asian American students who have said to me that they don't go by their name that they were given at birth, they go by their American name. I have had countless Latinx students who are white Latinx students who have said, yeah, I don't like to bring my white friends to my house because then they hear my parents speaking. So this is not uniquely for Black multilingual students, but it is absolutely, I would say, more intense because of anti-Blackness.
Right, right. Well, you really got at the core of some of these big ideas and topics of white supremacy and anti-Blackness in this space and in the space we work, and how important it is to consider when we're within this question about how do I teach students, when really you turned it back onto what is our role as educators, and especially as a white educator, thinking about the spaces I create in my classroom, what I value. So the last question that we have for our time together today is, this article closes by stating that the teacher training and professional development programs in the United States have a really big task of training teachers to support students in being socially, emotionally, and academically successful. And as we think about this particular article and its focus on Black English learners or Black multilingual learners, one member of our board stated, we can begin to combat this in teacher candidacy programs by speaking specifically to the roots of anti-Blackness in language education and empowering training teacher candidates to research and center the language practices of the students they have in their clinical practicum placements. So as a teacher educator yourself, what does this specifically mean?
It is a complex task. If we're thinking about like teacher candidates on the whole, particularly, I think context is really important. I have colleagues around the country who find themselves in spaces where it feels less relevant, right? It's not New Jersey, it's, Middle America, or spaces where the linguistic diversity is less. But something that is consistent in the literature is that a lot of times our teacher candidates are going into spaces and working with folks who also don't have asset-based perspectives. And so it becomes a real pressure and fight on that individual budding novice educator to simultaneously try to understand the building blocks of teaching and learning, while they're at the mercy in some ways of someone who should be mentoring them, who they themselves don't necessarily possess the background, the orientation towards Black multilingual students that they would need to model in any way for the teacher candidates, what that might look like. And so it is deeply complex, because as someone who is then affiliated with the university, who's preparing these teacher candidates, who's sending them out into spaces that may not be reflecting the ideals that we are trying to present to them within the institution, it's a heavy lift. And then what I meant about context is not only about the demographics of where you are, it's also about your institution. So, there are programs, I think, that do kind of support from undergrad through to the master's, but in programs like ours, they're supposed to get content before they get to us, right? And then when they get to us, we're just kind of doing the pedagogy side. But something that I've noticed is that you can really do some good work if you attend to the content. And what I mean by that is, and I mean, my goodness, a challenge is not even a big enough word to describe it, particularly when they're supposed to learn their content in undergrad in your standalone program. But the reason I'm saying that is because what I have found is that sometimes teacher candidates don't have basic historical literacy or don't have basic racial literacy. And what I mean by that is they don't really know about the transatlantic slave trade at all. So if you're thinking about all of humanity originating in Africa, but had the uniqueness of Black people, Afro-descended people being sold as chattel, as property. And you don't really understand what that looked like over hundreds and hundreds of years. And then how folks who are, you know, Afro-descended ended up in all of these places. Like, you actually don't know historically how folks ended up where they are. Then of course you're not going to have this inclination towards not devaluing their language practices, because you're not understanding how all these folks are from the same place, but they speak so differently.
Right.
Because you don't have that basic historical knowledge of African migratory patterns, which is involuntary migration, right? And how folks didn't just end up there. They came with their own languages already. They came with their own cultural patterns already. So of course it should look like a fusion, should it not? Because they were people with language and culture to begin with. But, you know, we kind of dehistoricize everything, and it just becomes, some Black people are French, some Black people speak Spanish, and it's not that simple. It's not that simple at all. So rather than having like this expectation that is not hierarchical, that says people are going to sound different because they came with their own religions, cultures, music, language, and then were forced into other societies as property. And this is a form of beauty that they brought to this other culture. This is a form of resistance that you can hear in their voices, in their actions, in their fashion. Because you don't have those two to put together, it is very, very much a challenge to get that done, even when students are doing like a longer program that might carry from undergraduate to graduate, but particularly in a setting where they're supposed to have gotten their content before getting to the pedagogical training, because then the time crunch becomes, you know, teacher licensure tests, focus on this, focus on that. And if you know anything about how that's designed, the standards that are developed for teacher licensure don't value having this knowledge. They don't ask about historical literacy. They don't ask about social justice. And so in this mad dash, this frenzy to attend to these standards, it's only more pressure to neglect something that, you know, it's kind of like a K-12 joke. If you've ever taught K-12, it's like the kids get to fourth grade and it's like, what did that third grade teacher do with them? Kids get to fifth grade, it's like, what did that fourth grade, right? Like everybody's looking around like, who did this?
Right.
And but it doesn't end, because that's the nature of standardized testing, where someone, whenever they land with you, they're the ones who are accountable for preparing them for this big test. And so between the crunch of the test, which is not valuing historical racial literacy, and between, you know, the structure sometimes of programs that says, no, they do content, no, they do content, no, they do history, no, they do history, it just kind of disappears. And so, you know, when you're just at the mercy of folks who feel that squeeze and who they themselves likely, and I think I had that discussion with Laura about, we were talking about like, you know, being like Jersey, born and bred kind of thing. And you go through your history curricula, your social studies curricula, and nobody teaches you anything about the history of Africa, the history of, you know, Asia. So you yourself don't have a background in it, but then you are suddenly in charge of filling in those gaps for folks who are going to become teachers. It perpetuates this cycle of historical illiteracy. So, you know, I think it's really a content question. And I think that we can't try to siphon it off and silo it and say, you do it over there, you do it over there, because it's an us thing. And that means we all have to value it too. So, you know, it's a deeper work, but I'm proud of the conversations that we've begun. I know that they get uncomfortable, but I've said this to you before, like, to me, that's a great sign. Like if everybody's feeling comfortable, I'm actually concerned.
I totally agree. And I've seen that in my own life, and I've tried to seek out opportunities and to feel uncomfortable, because I think it's when we're uncomfortable that we grow and we learn new things. And yeah, I agree. They have been at times uncomfortable, but we have had them and we continue to have them. So,
yeah.
Well, we're really towards the end of our time here. But is there anything else that you would like to add before we finish up?
I'm just like excited to look towards the future. The more that I get into these conversations, and I always bring up the tagline of like countering anti-Blackness and language education, beginning with ourselves.
Right.
Because that complexity, I feel like, is what helps us continue to see the humanity of folks. Our identities lie at intersections, and we have to be really critical about taking these kind of flat answers and these one-dimensional kind of understandings of, immigrants need this, Black people need that, and LGBTQ need that. Like, folks are multidimensional. Right. And I think that's a humanizing stance that we're taking. And I know it's uncomfortable because, especially if you're like from white population, dominant middle class population, because you don't have to make those considerations on a daily basis.
Right.
It's something you might opt into as a course, as the research agenda, but like for folks who live at the intersections like that, that complexity is so humanizing. And it's the beginning of what needs to be. The same way that you might go to a movie and you might see like a white protagonist as, someone who's like a hippie or a stargazer or living frugally, or who's a criminal or an astrologer, but they also might be a CEO or a Fortune 500. Like, they could be anything, right? They can have all of those stories. We need to give that same level of humanity, or recognize that same level of humanity in marginalized populations. And I think that's a kernel that if we don't like really, really digest and get down to that granular level, this work, it's not going to progress. Because at the very beginning of our conversation, our particular conversation, we're talking about the intersection of being Black and multilingual. Right. And that already, to accept that as a starting place, means that we have to accept the complexity of humanity and of the intersectional identities that our students occupy. If we can't start there, then the work is not going to take off. So if that's, if we have a final thought, like we have to get to the complexity of folks in order to humanize their experience, and then be in the work with them towards developing spaces institutionally in classrooms where the students can bring who they are, but also expect their teachers to be learning who they are and where they come from as well.
Thank you so much, Tasha, for inviting me to be the guest host and for being the guest. And I've appreciated all of the critical conversations and learned so much from the conversations you've had with different board members. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And thank you for just like jumping right in like this, because I know it's a lot to like set the conversation up and all that. But, I just appreciate that, like you digging in with both hands in that way, and, doing the work in ways that are not necessarily seen, right? Because I know for a fact, and I think anyone who does this for a decent amount of time, you realize that you can't just show up on a dime and be engaged in conversations like this. You've got to do some work when people aren't looking. So I appreciate that too.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us this week for NJTESOL-NJBE's Critical Conversation. I'm your host, Tasha Austin, and we'll see you next time.